Hi guys, Jackie from Famished Farm, and this week we are cooking out of the recipe stash. We tried 3 new recipes plus a bonus of taking 3 recipes as inspiration to make a dog treat recipe for our little stinky breath little Maltipoo. So we hope you'll stick around for the cooking part of this, but we made a chicken broccoli casserole, a garlicky shrimp and broccoli, and chicken yakitori. Now that one was actually a Weight Watcher recipe. It said 7 points. I have no idea if they're still doing points on Weight Watchers, but that was probably the best recipe. They were all 3 very good, but that one was really good. That recipe came from food.com. The other 2 recipes are from Eating Well, and I'll link everything in the description. But come along with me and let's do some cooking. First up on our week 3 of our healthy recipe series is the chicken yakitori from food.com. And we're starting with chicken thighs. And as you can see, I didn't trim these thighs before I put them in the bag. They came in a family size pack. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes and trim off the visible fat. And I usually use my kitchen shears to do that. And that does prove to be a pretty good way to go. Now you could go ahead and slice them or scissor them up while you're doing this point. I did it a little bit later, but you're just gonna put these into, grilling size pieces. They recommend 2-inch, and basically that's what I stuck to. Here comes my first deviation from the recipe. They want you to boil the marinade, prepare that, and then just baste the chicken with it while you're grilling. I decide to go ahead and do the chicken in a freezer bag and then just pour the sauce over the top of it without cooking it ahead of time. And that calls for some fresh garlic. And I don't have mirin, so I'm going to use rice vinegar and a little bit of sugar. And then the soy sauce, and that does call for a 1/4 cup of, and I'm using a low sodium soy, and then 2 tablespoons of sugar. And partly that was because of the mirin, and partly that's what the recipe calls for. And then I had prepared some minced garlic that I had in the freezer, and oh gosh, you see what happened there. I'm using a recycled Ziploc bag that has outlived its useful life, and we have a little disaster here. I'm going to use my kitchen sponge to clean this chickeny yuck mess up, but be sure to wash it well, and then I microwave it for a minute. Now, to make up for that missed sauce, I'm going to add, I think, a tablespoon of each, the soy sauce and the rice vinegar. And, I don't know how much it really impacted the flavor. It's no big deal. This was delicious. So instead of using another Ziploc bag, I'm just going to use this loaf pan that I grabbed when the bag started leaking. And this is going to go into the fridge. And I think I left it in there about 4 hours in the fridge with the saran wrap on it. Here I am. I'm just going to prepare the onions and the red pepper. And it did call for 2 red bell peppers. I use a red and an orange. You use whatever makes you happy. It's pretty when it has the red and the yellow and the orange colored peppers, but it makes no difference to the taste. Now, here I am threading the skewers, and I have stainless steel skewers, and these are really nice. They're flat. They're about a 3/8 of an inch or so thick. That's not right. 3/16 of an inch thick. So if you're just using these on the grill, they don't turn. The meat doesn't turn. It stays put when you turn it. But we really like this little grill basket we have, so we're going to go ahead and use the grill basket. Now, when you're doing your threading on of your meat and your veggies, anything that you touch, you have to assume it has, chicken cooties on it. So that's why you want to be sure to use up all of the pieces. You can't reuse this somewhere else, all of those pieces of red pepper and onion. So we just throw that on a skewer and that will go right on the grill too. Here it is being grilled. And here's the chicken off the skewer, and up top you can see the peppers and onions. This was excellent. I highly recommend this recipe. And our next recipe is the chicken and broccoli casserole. It does call for pre-cooked rice. So I'm rinsing my rice and I'm going to get that on the stovetop, get some water boiling and get the rice cooked while I'm doing other things. So this recipe called for chicken breast and cut into bite-sized pieces. I again trim off the visible fat, and then I'm going to slice them. And yes, this is me still hacking away with my steak knife. I don't have a nice slicer knife at the moment, and even if I did, I just gravitate toward that steak knife. I don't know why. But yes, you do you. You cut it however you like. Hopefully, just do it without cutting anything important, like your finger. Now, this recipe, you have some leeway here. You could have used chicken thighs. You could even use pre-cooked meat if you had it. But do whatever you've got in your pantry or whatever you're overstocked on. While this is cutting into bite-sized pieces, I will tell you the recipe calls for a large, high-sided, oven-proof skillet. I'm just going to use my cast iron and make do. If you have a high-sided, oven-proof skillet, definitely use it. I did leave out 1 cup of the chicken broth that the recipe calls for. Actually, you want to know, that's another change I made. I didn't call for chicken broth, it called for milk. I was out of milk. Actually, I had milk in the freezer, which I forgot to use. I forgot to write it down on my recipe. So I just used a carton of chicken broth, plus some of the chicken bone broth that I have in the freezer because I didn't quite have enough chicken broth. But you're just going to throw this chicken in your hot skillet, and you're going to basically just pre-cook this. You're browning it, searing it. You're going to add a little bit of garlic, and I'm just going to go ahead and pre-shred the cheese. It does call for 1.5 cups of reduced fat shredded cheese. You probably could get by with less. Makes no difference. The recipe also calls for pre-cooked, pre-packaged brown rice. I have white rice on hand, so that's what I'm using. Now, here's another interesting thing. We used, instead of the all-purpose flour, I just used almond flour. I had really good luck last week with a recipe that called for almond flour as a thickening agent, and it was delicious. So we're going to do that again this week. And here's me trying to get 4 cups of milk/chicken broth. You'll see I get 2, I think. No, I don't know. Whatever I got, I ended up using about 3 cups of liquid, including this frozen block of, it's a 1 cup block of bone broth. And we're just gonna let that melt. You'll see up top I've got my broccoli coming out of the microwave. And guys, if you're doing this too, be sure to drain that broccoli, kind of squeeze it dry once it cools down so you can do that. Here I am adding the shredded cheese. Somewhere I did go ahead and add the rest of the garlic. But you're just going to let this kind of simmer together. Then we're going to add a teaspoon of dry mustard, 1/2 teaspoon of garlic, salt and pepper. And there is one more ingredient, but we're not going to add that until the very end. Now you can see somewhere in here I've lost the picture of adding the pre-cooked rice. And then I'm going to move over to the island and add my broccoli. And I'm just going to try to mix this up and evenly distribute the broccoli throughout. This is good. Here's another secret ingredient. These, pre-cooked onions crispy fried onions. This was delicious. This is not cooked, but basically this is what it looked like when it came out of the oven. I didn't have it overly browned, but again, delicious. Our last recipe is a one-pot garlicky shrimp and broccoli, and this calls for 6 medium cloves of garlic sliced and divided. I can tell you we would never use that many cloves of garlic, so I use whatever I've got there, and I will dice it up, kind of mince it up. The recipe also, I will tell you, it calls for a large pot over medium heat once we get to giving this garlic a little sear on the pan. I use my big stock pot thinking I needed a large pot. You would be fine in any pot you've got. A cast iron, a saucepan, just not a tiny one. Use a good sized saucepan. You'll have plenty of room for this recipe. Now here I am with my Gigano big heavy stock pot, which I wish I didn't have to pull out. I've got some olive oil in there, and the garlic has cooked up a little bit. We've already gone ahead and cooked that broccoli. And remember, drain your broccoli before you put it in if you're pre-cooking it. If you're just using raw broccoli, you'll be fine. And then somewhere I diced that red bell pepper. Sorry, I missed filming that apparently, but throw that in there with some salt, some pepper. And then you are just gonna let this kind of saute. And it smells really good. Here I am seasoning, finishing the seasoning. I will tell you that this recipe said that it was, some people commented that it needed more seasoning. I don't know how they could taste anything after eating all that garlic. But once you're done sauteing your vegetables, you're just going to keep them warm in a separate bowl. And I use the same stock pot. I'm going to cook my rice, or my shrimp actually, and I'm going to put a little bit of salt and pepper on that. And then I'm adding my secret ingredient, some Trader Joe's umami seasoning, and a little bit of everything but the kitchen sink seasoning. A little bit more oil, and then just stir that up and you'll get going. Now, I am not going to cook this fully because I'm going to make this another night. This is going to go in the fridge and I'm going to have it in a couple nights, maybe the next night. I can't remember now. But it's just pre-cooking, so when I'm out gardening, I don't have to worry about dinner. Here is the pot with everything added to it. And you'll see I'm going to use my pretty little handmade ceramic dish with the little fish on it. And dump that all in there. I'm trying to get some of that fond from, underneath here. That's had a minute to soften up with all the veggies and I keep saying rice, but the shrimp in there. And this is also very good. Now, we're not garlic people, so don't quote me on that, but it was great. A simple, easy recipe. Chicken yakitori, or chicken kebabs, from food.com is billed as a 7-point Weight Watcher recipe, and this was delicious. I used just rice vinegar with the recipe calls for sugar, so I didn't add any extra sugar to it. And I did use the chicken thighs, although I doubled that just because I wanted to have chicken for lunch too. So delicious recipe as written, I am sure, but I did take some liberties with the directions. Instead of making the sauce and boiling it ahead of time, I just added it to the chicken, and then I put the chicken in the fridge for about 4 hours. I did grill the chicken and brush the chicken with the extra sauce, and this was absolutely delicious. I will make this again for sure. Chicken and broccoli casserole. This was delicious. Use chicken breast, use chicken thighs, use pre-cooked chicken. The recipe allows you to make lots of substitutions if you don't have what it calls for. I did use almond flour instead of all-purpose flour. I used chicken broth instead of milk, and frozen broccoli instead of raw broccoli. I also just made up my rice instead of using pre-cooked packages. It was delicious. Make sure you have a big skillet, because you can see from this picture that's with only 3 cups of liquid, and it is full to the brim. Now, we didn't bake this the day of. We made it a couple nights later, and I took it out of the fridge, went directly into a 350 oven, and it did take about an hour. One pot garlicky shrimp and broccoli is our last recipe for human consumption, and this was very good. My husband preferred this one over the shrimp one we had last week. Both were good, but he liked this one better. It's garlicky. Even the little bit of garlic we used was a lot of garlic. So we did not put the 6 medium cloves in. We also used frozen broccoli. But we did put the full pound. That was perfect. This was very good. If you're going to serve with rice, use chicken stock, and you could also make cauliflower rice maybe to go with it, but it was very good. So changes to the directions, I think we did pretty much everything as is, but you can get by with a large saucepan on this. I pulled out my stock pot. It was unnecessary. If you too wake up next to a dog with stinky breath, this little bonus recipe may be for you. What I've done is taken 3 different recipes that are for dogs with bad breath, and I'm kind of using them as inspiration to come up with something that I like. I started out there with an apple that was cored and 2 carrots that I just processed till they were, roughly grated. And then I'm adding 1.25 cups of coconut flour. I keep mine in the freezer, so it's kind of lumpy. That's what I'm dealing with there. And then I'm going to add an egg. And some of my honey. It is kind of crystallized. I'm shooting for about 2 tablespoons here. 1 glug, 2 glugs. And then we're going to kind of mix this up and see kind of where we stand before we add any water. This is the parsley. Now here I would recommend that you just go get a bunch of parsley, fresh parsley, and chop it up. Do the same thing with mint. I didn't have either one fresh, so I'm just adding roughly about 1/8 of a teaspoon of peppermint extract. And then we're just going to get rid of the coconut flour lumps, add our water, and make our dough. And now, because we use, let's not forget the main ingredient, our activated charcoal. I picked this because her favorite toothpaste has activated charcoal in it. So this is very lightweight. You want to stir very slowly. But this is what you'll look like when you're all incorporated. Now, because we use the coconut flour, that needs to hydrate, so we're just going to set it aside at roughly about an hour. And I do pull the saran off and just check it to make sure it looks like it's about the right consistency for a dough. So we come back in an hour. I take half of it, and we're just going to try to pat it using our hands into a roughly rectangular shape and see how the cutting process goes. Now, I cut typically my treats in long strips and use the pizza peeler, the pizza wheel, but I can tell that this is just not holding its shape. So we're going to start again about half of that. And we are going to this time pull out our rolling pin and see if we can get a little more even force to help this dough hold together. Now I do use my bench scraper here to get it into a roughly rectangular shape. And then I'll keep going back over it with the rolling pin just to get as rectangular as I can. And I think you can tell just by the little bits that are pulling off or just falling off the sides there, it's not a workable dough at this point. If you were to use this, it would be crumbly instead of holding together as a little, you know, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch dog treat. So we do keep kind of playing with it to see if we are going to have any luck. I probably spent too much time on this part when I kind of already knew that I was going to be playing with some more ingredients. But there you go. Attempt number 2 on cutting our strips. Take it a little slower this time. And let's see what she decides to do. Yeah, see how that just kind of collapses? It's not going to work. Cut your losses, Jack. Back to the drawing board. So trial number 2. Back into our mixing bowl. And then I'm going to be consulting the recipe to see what we should do. One of the recipes uses 2 eggs, so we'll add 2 eggs. We add a tablespoon or 2 of the olive oil. And then we're going to mix again. There's our 2nd tablespoon. And we'll mix that part up. And then I remember in my gluten-free baking, you always add more than one type of gluten-free flour. So I add almond in addition to the coconut, and we'll incorporate that. And after a few seconds, this is our new batter. Now, almond oil does not need to hydrate, so I'm going to go right to our experiment. This is roughly half the batch, and I can tell already that it is holding together better. So we are actually going to get this formed into our rectangle, and then we'll tamp it down one more time. And then I decide instead of using the bench scraper, I'm going to use, I've got a little spatula that will work a little better on separating these. And these stay together better. They're still crumbs, but that's okay. I can live with crumbs. But you can move them and they basically stay as a solid chunk. So we're going to finish this tray. I'm just showing you the whole process so you can see. I think it took roughly 8 minutes on this first batch to get to this point, and I think the next one was 5 minutes. So it is kind of a time-consuming thing, but I think it's much quicker than trying to cut out, you know, dog bone shapes or whatever shapes you might have cookie cutters for. And your dog doesn't know it's not in the shape of a bone. Your dog doesn't care. Your dog just wants it to taste good. So once this pan is ready, we're going to throw it into a 350 degree oven, and we have preheated it. And I've set the timer for 30 minutes. But after 10 minutes, I think to myself that maybe that 350 will be too high, that maybe it will brown too darkly on the top before the inside gets cooked. And so I turn it down to 300 degrees, and then I cook for an additional hour. And I do take out the first pan, this one that is just going in. I take that out 10 minutes before the other one. So total cook time this day was about an hour and 20 minutes for 2 pans. And this is the number of treats that I'm getting from the 2 pans. I had already put pan number 1 in my little plastic quart container, and that goes into my freezer. And then the remaining treats I'll keep at the back door, so when Tilly Girl comes in, we can just grab one of these to try. And I do remember I'm much better about labeling what things are, so that's a big win. Now, I told you earlier that I don't mind all of these little bits and pieces. At the end of the bag or the end of the container, I take all of those and just throw them in her dog dish, and she thinks it's an extra special little treat. So no problem with these little bits and pieces. But the real test is going to be, will she eat it?